The Senate canceling a week-long holiday break to stay in session as lawmakers try and hammer out a debt ceiling deal. Joining us right now is Senator Ron Johnson. He's a member of the Budget and Appropriations Committees. And Senator, you have certainly been making waves with this issue. You've been corresponding back and forth with Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. And what have you learned along the way?
Well, not much from Secretary Geithner, unfortunately. No, my communication with Secretary Geithner is the basic fact that Washington is pretty well broken. I mean, let's face it, the Senate's fiddling while America's going bankrupt. And to just assume that we're going to get an increase in the debt ceiling, I believe, was totally irresponsible. And I thought they better lay in a contingency plan. And, unfortunately, my predictions are kind of coming true that, we're certainly the talks are broken down. So we have to move toward a real solution in terms of the fact that we're bankrupting this nation.
By a solution, you mean the letter that you've written to the Treasury Secretary is that he should be able to pay all of our debts that we owe to Treasury holders and then just cut our budget?
Now, listen, that's just talking about a contingency plan in case we don't get an increase in the debt ceiling. Again, I think it's highly irresponsible the way this administration has been scaring the markets, scaring the American public, threatening to send out letters to Social Security recipients that they're not going to get their checks. That's not necessary. It really isn't. We'd have $2.6 trillion to spend. We could allocate that, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the real solution.
Before we move on to the real solution,
Sure.
Let's talk about some of those charges, because as the Secretary laid out in his response to you, it's not just Democrats who are saying this. It is not a one party who's doing this. Most of the people I talk to in the financial markets, Democrat or Republican, are very concerned about this issue and don't know what the consequences would be, not only if we didn't pay, if we defaulted some way on our Treasury debt, but if we weren't paying some of our other obligations as well that were passed in a budget that did go through Congress.
Well, sure. Again, that's business as usual here in Washington. And again,
it's not just Washington. We're talking about Wall Street, too. Let's take Washington out for a moment. These are people who watch the markets very closely.
Sure. I understand. I tell you, my greater fear is when we actually face the structural bankrupting of America. I mean, when we actually hit that day of reckoning when people won't buy our debt, when our interest rates spike the way they do in Greece. I mean, we can just take a look at what's happening in Greece. But Becky, the solution to this thing, I've always felt was a two-step process.
Okay.
We've got to first enact the fiscal disciplines, the spending caps, and there's a number of ways of doing that. Either as absolute numbers, a percent, spending as a percentage of GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP. But we need to put that in place statutorily. Then we also have to pass a constitutional amendment to limit the size of government and lead to eventually a balanced budget. I was listening to Governor Wilder earlier. The difference between Washington and the states is most states have a constitutional requirement to balance the budget. That's why their budget deficits don't get so far out of control. I mean, in my own state of Wisconsin, Governor Walker was dealing with a $1.8 billion a year budget deficit. It's 1,000 times worse here in Washington because we don't have that limitation. So, what I've been advocating internally within the Republican Party in the Congress is let's get the House to pass those structural caps, that spending, fiscal discipline, attach that to an increase in the debt ceiling, move that legislation into the Senate, and say, hey, listen, we're reasonable about this.
Yeah.
Senator, and I think that's the solution.
Yeah, that's something we've heard from a lot of parties, too. You'd be satisfied with going ahead and raising that debt ceiling as long as it came with some sort of limitations that come down the road to make sure we get our house in order? Yeah,
not just some sort, but the ones that actually fix the problem. We do need to do some cutting, and the Ryan budget does that initially to lower that baseline to that results in real cuts long term, but then pass the statutory caps and then a constitutional amendment. If we do those three elements, it really does fix the problem. A lot of people criticize that as just process, but that's the first step. We're never going to solve this problem with the detailed solutions right out of the block. You've got to first establish that discipline.
Do you think that there's a likelihood that some sort of agreement like that could be reached by the deadline?
What I'm seeing in the Senate and in the House is a growing group of people that understand that, and really kind of across the spectrum, that want to do that. And that's, I think, the good thing about coming back next week. It's going to allow us to work on that. And I hope we can, structure that legislation quickly, get the House to pass it, again, tied to an increase in the debt ceiling, so that Republicans we come off as being responsible.
Right.
And I think we are. We're the only ones that are serious about that. It's the Democrat Senate that has not passed a budget in over 2 years.
Right.
It's President Obama that dropped a budget in Congress that lost 0 to 97. It was so unserious. So trust me, Republicans are serious about this. We understand how urgent the problem is, and we are willing to work in good faith with anybody who is willing to seriously address the fact that we are bankrupting this nation. This cannot go on. This is the moment in time where we have got to make a stand, and that's what Republicans want to do.
All right. Well, Senator, we know that you are going to be in session next week working through this. We appreciate your time today and wish you a happy 4th of July, too.
Well, same to you. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Thank you.
At the office.
At the office.
Happy
Yeah,
4th
it's going to be
of July at the office.
It's going to be work.
When we come back this morning, how to make money in the second half of the year, some expert advice and an